welcome back to the third session on the series on apologetics. And so in the series, we're going to be talking about this idea of giving a rational justification for the truth claims of Christianity. And when I say that, I simply mean that we should be able to look at the facts and philosophy and just observable things about this universe and this world we live in and come to a rational conclusion that God exists and that the truth claims of Christianity are something that we can really believe. And the last few classes we've been kind of laying a foundation, so that we started off with a history of apologetics, talking about what apologetics is, the different types of apologetics. And then last class we were talking about some of the more philosophical underpinnings of what we're going to be doing and the questions we're going to be asking. For example, we talked about logic and just how logic works, how you can apply logic in a setting of argumentation. And we're going to use that now, going from asking last time the question about philosophical naturalism, or the idea that the natural world, the things that we can observe with science, are all that exist. And we're going to now take that a step further, and we're going to start looking at some really classic and foundational arguments of modern Christian apologetics. But sticking in the vein of kind of logic and philosophical underpinnings of what we're going to be doing, I wanted to start with this idea of what does it mean for something to be a good explanation. Now, there's a lot of things you might think of, and if you want to take a moment and pause the video to think to yourself and try and talk it through with yourself of what makes something a good explanation. And I'm not talking about just an explanation of any one thing, but I'm saying overall, like philosophically, what makes something a good explanation to any question. And I think there's a couple of principles that we can apply broadly. The first is simplicity. Okay, you may have heard of this as Occam's razor. So all else being equal, the simplest explanation is preferable, and we're not going to multiply causes unnecessarily. If we look at an example from the Bible, if you want to take it that way, we can see that at one point Jesus is asked, "Teacher, what's the greatest commandment?" And he says, well, the Shema and the command to love your neighbor as yourself summed up the whole law, thus providing a simple explanation. And what that means is that there's so many different laws, but if you keep these two, then all else is going to follow from here. And so he was giving a very simple explanation. And today, and what we're going to be going through here is we're realizing that, and I think we've seen it in Scripture, is preferable and superior to the legalism of the Pharisees, where we're going to have every single tiny thing as all that we're paying attention to, and that's where we're getting our entirety of the law from. And Jesus isn't saying don't follow those, but he's giving a simple explanation. If you follow these two and you do it correctly, then the others are going to naturally flow from there. Two other things that I think are helpful for making something a good explanation is something I would call explanatory power and explanatory scope. So when I'm saying explanatory power and scope, we're talking about making sense of the data, both an individual point and the whole range of points. So think of it as the depth and the width of the explanation. So when I say depth, I mean that this explanation can explain an individual data point really, really well. And if I'm talking about scope or width, then I'm saying that the explanation can account for a wide variety of data points. So the more it accounts for, the better. Later on, we're going to look at the case for the resurrection of Jesus, and we're going to see that resurrection theory has both good depth, so it explains individual data points really well, such as the empty tomb, for example, and it also has good width or scope to explain all of the relevant data points, such as the transformation of the disciples, or the conversion of James, or the conversion of Paul. And so that's kind of the idea that we're going to get with explanatory power and scope. We're looking for both of these in a good explanation. And then the fourth one is ad hocness. Now, if something is ad hoc, then that would be what we would consider a fallacy, which we talked about last time. And so an ad hoc explanation is something that's artificially constructed to fit specific observations without broader justification. For example, if, I don't know, something silly, somebody believes the earth is flat, and suddenly they say, oh, well, in order to explain gravity, I'll have to assume that the earth is constantly accelerating upwards at 9.8 meters per second squared. That would be an ad hoc explanation. You're just simply making a new theory to tack onto your old theory in order to explain something that isn't working anymore. Another explanation might be that when astronomers that were associated with the church were trying to resist the heliocentric model of the solar system, they kept introducing these new complex epicycles to explain why the planets aren't moving in simple arcs across the sky, and instead why they kind of go back suddenly every now and then and just make these little bitty loops in the sky throughout their orbit. And they had to keep introducing another epicycle and another epicycle and another epicycle on every single planet that they were seeing, because they were trying to make the motion of all of the heavenly and celestial bodies fit their geocentric model, rather than just accepting the heliocentric model, which provided kind of the opposite of this is a simple explanation, which is we're all revolving around the sun. And then you just needed one cohesive theory in that version in order to make everything work. So these 4 data points, and they're not the only thing, but these 4 points are the things I look for if I'm wanting to see if something is going to be a good explanation. And so when we're trying to provide logical explanations for the phenomena that we encounter or the things we experience, these are typically the things we're looking for. And I think a lot of us are looking for these things whether or not we really understand that that's what we're doing. It's just natural. We want a simple explanation. We want something that can explain the data well. We want something that can explain all the data rather than just some of it. And so we're going to use these principles today as we dive into some natural theology. And again, when I say natural theology, I'm talking about providing arguments and evidence in support of theism. So not just Christianity, but theism as a whole, independent of authoritative divine revelation. And again, if you haven't really thought about it, why might it be advantageous to not assume the inspiration of the Bible when dealing with the question of God's existence? Well, when we look at the Bible as Christians, we're going to say that the Bible is the inspired divine word of God. And if that's true, then the Bible is what we would call authoritative, because God has authority, and therefore if this is God's word, then we should listen to it because it's going to give us authoritative, truthful statements, things that we can and should listen to. But if we're talking to a skeptic, they won't see the Bible in the same way that you and I do. Because if they did, they probably wouldn't be a skeptic in the first place. And maybe a good example of this is when we look back at how Paul handled the Greeks. He didn't go to Scripture in order to try and prove Christianity when he engaged in apologetics. Instead, Paul turned to Stoic philosophers, and he turned to Greek playwrights, and he turned to things that they might see as authorities. And so when you're talking to a skeptic, it's really helpful to stop and think about, what will that person consider authoritative? What sources do they listen to as sources of truth? A lot of people in the world today look at science as a source of truth, and to an extent it is. Absolutely. I mean, science tells me tons of things about my work because I'm a scientist. There's a lot of good, true information that's come out of science. And so a lot of people will view that as an authority. And more specifically, we're going to view maybe your doctor as an authority on physical health. We're going to view a cardiologist as the authority on the heart. We're going to view a rocket scientist as an authority on aerodynamics. And there's all these different authorities that we're going to have. Some other authorities that maybe we wouldn't think about in the same way, but I think really are viewed as authoritative, is political figures. How many people are going to look at the leader of their preferred political party, and whatever that person says goes? I think we've all met people like that. And to an extent, I think that we all have that somewhat more or less, depending on how involved we are in politics. Another example would be, let's even stick with religion, religious leaders. So if we look at charismatic religious leaders, we can look at cults that formed. Think about Waco. And the cult that happened there and all the fires that a lot of people died for, is they were following a charismatic leader. To them, that became their religious authority. If we look at the idea that this American dream where democracy is everything, and we've put so much focus on democracy, and everybody has the right to vote, everybody has the right to have a say in what goes on in our country, that we've developed this idea that the majority rules. Whatever most people think is right, suddenly that is what's right. Instead of realizing that we're not asking everybody to come together and decide what's correct. We're hoping that everybody can come together and discern what's correct, which is a really big difference. Because if everyone's deciding what's correct, then we're saying that the majority rules because the majority decides what's right, rather than discerning what's right, in which we're looking to truth outside of ourselves. And so there's kind of this myth of democratic rule that the majority of people are deciding what's right. And a lot of people, especially in America, will view the majority as authority. And there's tons of other examples you might think of. But whenever you go into these conversations, it's really helpful to see, what does this person, what does this skeptic that I'm speaking with listen to as an authority in their life, especially on the topics that we're discussing? And how can I take those authorities and utilize them to lead somebody to God? And so another way we can look at this is something that's called the minimal facts approach. So when reasoning with a skeptic, it's best to only use that data which is agreed upon by the vast majority of scholars, both religious and secular. And the reason we do that is because that's going to hit a lot more closely as to what the person we're talking to views as authoritative. And at the same time, it's ensuring that we're not engaging in circular reasoning, in which we're saying, well, I believe there's a God because the Bible says that there's a God, and I believe the Bible's true because the Bible is the Word of God. That would be circular reasoning. So by not relying on the Bible to tell us that there is a God, first let's establish that there's a God aside from assuming the Bible's inspired. Then, once we've established there's a God, now we can look at the Bible and say, is this the Word of the God that I've already established? And are its contents true? And I think we'll be able to show that as well, but we'll save that for a later time. Right now we're going to stick with natural theology. So this is the approach that I'm going to use in this series for pretty much all of the apologetics that we're going to deal with. And using this approach, we're going to ask what I think is a very basic question, but at the same time there's some depth to it, which is simply, why does anything exist at all? And so this is going to be under a large umbrella called cosmological arguments. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the Kalam Cosmological argument. So put yourself in the perspective of a skeptic and ask that question. Why does anything exist rather than nothing? Look around and you see maybe a house, maybe a car if you're listening to this on your drive. You see the sky, the stars, the moon, the sun, whatever's around you. There's a whole universe out there, and it's incredible, and it's vast. And you could conceive of a universe that was slightly different than this one, right? Maybe it has different laws of physics. Maybe it's the same universe like we have, but you were born into a different family. There's so many other ways the universe might have looked, and it might have appeared. But at the same time, it's conceivable that there was no universe and that nothing existed. And so we have to ask, why does the universe exist? And there's a couple of really intriguing aspects to this question. And I think a lot of it stems from two key principles. And both of these are observable. One is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's something that's confirmed every day in our lives. The second is that the universe began to exist. Now, practicing what we talked about last time, if we grant premises 1 and 2, then let's look at the conclusion. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And we can see that the conclusion here follows premises 1 and 2. And so if somebody wants to object to the idea that the universe has a cause, then they're going to need to object to either premise 1 or premise 2. And so we're going to go through some ideas on how we might defend these premises so that we can have rational justification in our belief that the universe was caused. Furthermore, I find it incredibly helpful to try and defend ideas that I don't agree with, as it exposes weaknesses in my own views and it helps me understand what my skeptical friends might be thinking. So for the moment, put your skeptic hats on. And before we get into it, how might people object to these premises? Take a moment, pause the video, start there. Okay, now that you have a few of those ideas in your mind, I want you to take those questions into the further discussion. So let's look at premise 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, using only facts and concepts that a skeptic is likely to accept, what reason do we have to believe this is true? Well, first off, if we're to begin to say that things can begin to exist uncaused, then we've undermined the entirety of the scientific enterprise. Because the entirety of science is we're assuming that the effects that we see are caused by the things that we're doing. That's how experiments work. And so if we begin to say that, well, some things can just begin to exist uncaused, then suddenly science means nothing. And so if somebody was to object to this, then they would be scientifically unsound, and furthermore, they'd be philosophically unsound to suggest that something can come into being uncaused and from nothing. And when I'm talking about this idea of beginning to exist or into being, I'm not talking about this particle began to exist, like a photon began to exist from the beginning of the time, or all matter was created all at the beginning of the universe. What I'm saying is what we would call ontologically, so the essence of something. For example, I have a pin here. Now, at one point, all of the materials of this pin were in manufacturing plants or in rubber plants and plastic plants, and there was somebody was producing the ink, and all of this was brought together and put together with the spring and the point, and it became a pen. Now, we can argue about at what point this thing became a pen, but at one point there was no pen, and now there's a pen. So this pen began to exist, and there was a cause for its existence. The cause for its existence was somebody manufactured it, and somebody manufactured it because they could make money doing so. And they could make money doing so because I need to be able to write, so I'm going to buy the pen. And you can trace this cause and effect back and back and back and back, right? But you'll find that everything that begins to exist, whether it's a physical object or even an idea, has a cause. So that's the first idea that we're dealing with. Secondly, if things could come into being uncaused and from nothing, it's inexplicable that anything and everything doesn't pop into existence everywhere. And at first this may seem strange because you might object, well, we don't know the frequency at which things can come into being uncaused and from nothing. But if we're saying from nothing, an actual nothing, something that doesn't exist, then there's an infinite amount of that. There's an infinite number of things that don't exist. There's an infinite number of causes that don't exist. There's an infinite amount of nothing. It would be like multiplying infinity by 0. It's still 0. So nothing can exist infinitely, and if nothing exists infinitely, then why is there, it doesn't matter what the frequency is, it will always be caused because it's coming from nothing, which there's no limit to. And so, therefore, it's really weird that we don't see anything and everything popping into existence everywhere and out of nothing. So the fact that we don't see that happening should give us good reason to believe that whatever begins to exist has a cause. But maybe more practically, this is just constantly confirmed by our experience. We don't see things that begin to exist without a cause. And so if somebody wants to object to this premise, then they're having to provide evidence against intuitive reasoning and our observation. And so that's going to be a really difficult hill for that person to climb. Second is this idea that the universe began to exist. Okay, so again, let's use only the facts and concepts that a skeptic is likely to accept. What reason do we have to accept this premise? Why do we think the universe began to exist? Well, there's kind of two lines of reasoning that we can take here. There's a philosophical line and a scientific line. I want to deal with the philosophical line first because I think it's one we don't really think about, but it's also really important. And so it goes like this. An actually infinite number of things can't exist. A beginningless series of events in time entails an actually infinite set of things. Therefore, a beginningless series of events in time cannot exist. Essentially, what we're saying is that the past cannot go back indefinitely. We can't say, here's an effect, so there's the cause, and there's the cause of that, and there's the cause of that, and get what we would call this infinite regress into the infinite past. This is something that we would find from infinite set theory mathematics, and it's something that's really well established in philosophy. is that there has to be a first uncaused cause. Because if time went back indefinitely, all the way into the infinite past, then we would be trying to claim that an infinite number of things, in other words, moments in time, had occurred to get to the moment that we're in right now. Maybe a practical way to look at it is this idea between the difference of a potential infinite and an actual infinite, because you might be thinking, well, I do believe that time is infinite because I believe that we're going to live eternally, and so that would be a potential infinite because it hasn't happened yet, right? It would be like the difference between me saying I'm going to count to infinity, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you come back in 10 years and I'm saying 10,197, 10,198, whatever I'm at, right? And you would say, oh, he's counting to infinity. He's not there yet, but he's working on it. Now, imagine if the inverse happened, and you came up and you walked up to me, and I said 3, 2, 1, 0, and you said, what are you doing? And I said, oh, well, I just finished counting down from infinity. Now, even just saying it, you can hear how silly that sounds. You can't have completed an infinite set because that would be an actual infinite, and actual infinites cannot exist. There's a number of examples that we could come up with, but I find that one to be one of the best illustrations of the idea. And if we have an infinite series of events in time, that would be an infinite number of things. And so we could have never arrived at the moment that we're in, yet here we are. And so philosophically, it's unsound to say that the universe didn't have a beginning, that there was no beginning to time. So that's kind of the philosophical line of it. We call it the infinite regress problem. Keep it in mind whenever we're dealing with some of the objections that we're going to talk about later. So the scientific line of reasoning, it has to do with measurements that we've taken in the universe. And so what's really cool is that God could have made any kind of universe he wanted to. But instead of doing perhaps the intuitive thing and making the universe a specific size and shape, he chose to make a universe that is constantly expanding. And the way we know this is doing some fancy measurements with telescopes up in space. And so let's say that we're looking here on Earth at a distant galaxy with a telescope, and we can figure out the rate at which that galaxy is moving away from us. And we're going to use that same measurement, and we're going to do it on a whole bunch of galaxies, and we're going to plot those speeds and distances out on a graph. And by doing so, we were able to determine something called the Hubble constant, which describes the rate of expansion of the universe. And so by plotting this data on a multidimensional graph, we're able to project those data backwards in time. And so if we look and we have time on the y-axis here and space on the x-axis, it makes this cone. As time goes up and moves forward, then space is expanding in this case a two-dimensional, but we would know it as a three-dimensional direction. And now taking those measurements and going backwards, we can find this little bitty point where the cone starts. And so scientists would call this convergence, or rather the beginning of the expansion, the Big Bang. And so if we want to meet a skeptic where they are, it's important to recognize that even in secular models of cosmology, both time and space had a beginning. Think about that for a second. Not only space, but time also had a beginning. That's mind-blowing when you begin to think about it. I can't say there was something before time, because before means time. So something we would say, there could have been existence sans time, so without time. Now, because this model of cosmology is the probably most widely accepted model of the universe, then most skeptics are already committed to premise 2, that the universe began to exist. And if they want to object that, suddenly they're the ones that are objecting to scientific data and established scientific concepts. And so we can wrap up this argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And before we move on, pause. Make sure that this actually makes sense to you. If it doesn't, go back and watch that section again, reach out to me, or just look up some information. There's plenty of other people on YouTube that have talked about this. There's other websites that have gone through this. Plenty of material out there, but this is just a really cool argument. And so now we're going to deal with some objections. And I want you to keep in mind the objections I'm going to give you here are fairly academic. I don't think you're going to come across a skeptic that is going to give you these objections, at least not with any level of frequency. However, I think it's really important that we introduce ourselves to some of the most powerful objections to our faith in a controlled setting like this one. Because if you don't seek out objections and challenges to your faith, then the only time that you're ever going to encounter them is in a hostile environment where your faith is actually being challenged. If I can present these to you here and give you the tools on how to reason through them and understand these objections and how to answer them, then your faith is going to be that much stronger. So, let's look at this first objection, all right? And this one's going to be about quantum mechanics. Now, I'm not asking you to know about quantum mechanics, but I want you to apply a couple of principles. First, once I give you this objection, I want you to try and think about which premise of the Kalam Cosmological argument is being objected to, and what are some potential problems with the objection. So, the first objection is, and I'm going to role play this for you real quick, just so you can see where this might come up. Let's say that I'm talking to a skeptic, and they were talking about the Big Bang and some cool science stuff, and I say, yeah, the Big Bang, one of the coolest things about it is that it's not just about when space began to expand, it's also about when time began. And so the fact that space and time seem to have a beginning points to the idea that something caused the universe. And so it really makes me wonder, what could have possibly caused the universe to begin to exist? And the skeptic, if they're well educated, might respond, well, no. It doesn't have to be caused. You see, quantum mechanics shows that at the subatomic level, like the singularity, for example, events are said to be uncaused. And in the same way, the whole universe could have sprung into being out of the subatomic vacuum. And so pause your video real quick and think about a couple of questions. One, what is this person objecting to? Premise one, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Or premise two, that the universe began to exist. And then think about how you might respond to that objection. Okay, it seems to me that the theoretical person I have here is objecting to the idea that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Note that they're saying events are said to be uncaused under quantum mechanics. And so there's a couple of issues with this objection, right? The first issue is this idea that the whole universe could have sprung into being out of the subatomic vacuum. The subatomic vacuum is not nothing. We're not saying that the universe began to exist from a subatomic vacuum. We're saying that the universe began to exist. The subatomic vacuum would be part of the universe. And so something that didn't exist until the universe existed certainly couldn't have caused the universe, because there was no subatomic vacuum to begin with. And it kind of bleeds into the second objection or rebuttal to this objection, which is that quantum mechanics operates under a certain set of laws that are part of the laws of this universe. Now, albeit those laws may not be super well understood yet, but it doesn't matter how well we understand them. Those are still laws of nature. Those are laws of the universe. And so, without a universe, then there could have been no laws governing quantum mechanics. Therefore, the quantum mechanics that didn't exist yet, because their laws didn't exist, couldn't have begun the universe. And so what's happening is your skeptic in this situation is confusing nothing with something infinitely small. Okay, a singularity is not nothing. An infinitely small particle is still a particle. It's not nothing. There's a vast chasm of difference between something that's infinitely small and nothing. And so this person is claiming that nothing caused the universe. And when I'm saying that, I mean metaphysically, ontologically, nothing. Or at least that's why they think they're claiming, but the subatomic vacuum isn't nothing. So really, this entire objection is undermined because we're not talking about what could have happened after the first Planck time of the expansion of the universe. We're talking about what began the expansion of the universe from nothing. So the second objection that we would look at is this one. Now imagine the same scenario, and I've said, well, it's really interesting that, if we can see that the universe began to exist, and something must have caused the universe. And we might get the objection. Well, I mean, sure, under the Big Bang there might be an objection, there might be a beginning, but there are other models that don't require a beginning of the universe, such as the steady state model, or various cyclic models, or even the Hartle-Hawking model. And real quick, a steady state model would be an older cosmological model suggesting that the universe is expanding, yes, but the universe is eternal and it has a constant density, with matter being continuously created to account for the expansion. Now, largely this is older and has been rejected by the scientific community. So by throwing this out there, it seems to me that this person might have read a thing or two, but doesn't realize that the scientific consensus has moved well past this model. With a cyclic model, this would be the idea that we have the universe expanding right now, but eventually gravity will win out against the expansion, and we'll have everything collapse back in on itself in something that we would call the Big Crunch, right? And then after it collapses back in on itself, it'll go all the way back to a singularity and then begin to expand again. And that would avoid the need for a definitive beginning. A problem with this is that there is no known math right now that could possibly allow for expansion to begin again after contraction. There's been a lot of models that have attempted it, and we haven't found anything. Now, I'm not saying that math will never be discovered. I think it would be foolish of us to say that because something hasn't been discovered yet, it never will be discovered. That would be leaning in towards what we might call a God of the gaps theory, or at least something akin to it, which I really want to avoid because I find that to be fairly fallacious. But in order to take this view of the cyclic model, then the skeptic is still putting their trust in something, namely that there is math that will be discovered here. And so it's interesting that this is still a leap of faith, which is not all that different than believing in a creator. And then thirdly, we have this Hartle-Hawking model, which is what we would call a no-boundary proposal. And so you remember that cone I showed you earlier where space and time are expanding outward and upward? Well, the Hartle-Hawking model essentially takes the math that gave us that cone, and they put imaginary numbers, which, remember, that's a number with the letter I next to it. You would get that by taking the square root of a negative number. Okay, we use that little I to denote the square root of a negative number. And it places those types of numbers in the time variable to smoothly transition from time as a fourth spatial dimension to time as a, the time dimension we have now, whenever the universe begins. So geometrically, it transforms the cone that we saw earlier into a sphere with defined limits, but no edges. Now, of course, there is the problem with this of what on earth would imaginary time look like in reality? Even Stephen Hawking was skeptical that imaginary time could translate to anything practical. And what's interesting is that if at any point you multiply out those imaginary numbers in the Hartle-Hawking model in order to get back to real numbers that actually have meaning in the universe and reality, then you get back to that same cone shape. So it's a nifty transformation geometrically, but it doesn't actually translate to anything within reality. Now, all of that aside, if we look back beyond just the science at the philosophical side of things, then what we'll see is that all of these fail to account for the infinite regress problem that we talked about earlier, that there has to be a definite beginning. We can't go backwards infinitely in time, otherwise we could have never gotten to the current moment that we have now. So, no matter what model is thrown out, if the claim is that the universe didn't need a beginning, we can still philosophically show that, yeah, it did. Reality needed a beginning. That's just a philosophically understood aspect of time and numbers and series of events. And so those are two of the kind of key, those are two what I think are the strongest objections that I've seen to this argument. I've looked into them. I don't really think that they hold water. So I think that we're left with the same conclusion. The universe had a cause. Now, again, we're going to practice this a little more. So I'm going to model a conversation for you that you might have with a skeptic, and I'm going to pause between responses, then so that you can think about how you would respond. Then I shall continue the conversation. Okay. So whenever you're having a conversation with a skeptic, there's a couple of principles that are really important to think about. One, we talked about this in the first class, is speak with gentleness and humility. let's be honest, we don't know everything. There's a lot of people out there that are a lot smarter than me. I'm guessing there's people out there that are smarter than you too. And so when you're talking with somebody, don't go into assuming that you know everything. And if you aren't sure about something, admit that. Tell them, that's a great question. I don't know an answer. Let me get back to you on it. Don't throw out ideas that you don't know to be true, because if you're wrong and they can call you out on it, suddenly it's weakened your position a whole lot more than if you were just say, that's a good question, let me go look into this. Second is we need to be clear in our arguments. So this goes back to that idea of simplicity. Another thing is just, it doesn't matter how simple and good explanatory power and scope you have in all of your explanations. If you don't explain it in a way that somebody else understands it, then you haven't communicated effectively, and the likelihood of that person accepting your argument is much, much lower. Next, don't get thrown off track by a red herring. So when I say red herring, I mean something that is outside of the scope of the conversation you're trying to have and is simply going to provide a distraction rather than getting that person to understand the argument that you're actually putting forward. And then I want you to try and use the Kalam to convince me during this conversation that we're kind of having asynchronously and over the internet that the universe was caused. And so that's what we're going to be trying to do in this situation. All right. And one other thing is, before moving on from one objection, try and make sure to close out the conversation on the previous one. And the reason I say that is because there's times where you can have, for example, in this conversation, as if I'm a skeptic, then I might object to the idea that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And if you have provided good evidence for why that is, then before I cede that point, I might just say, well, okay, but the universe didn't even necessarily have a beginning. And if we move on to the second point, and we didn't ever close out the first conversation, then by the time we finish talking about the second point of whether or not the universe began to exist, I can say, well, it still doesn't mean that it was caused. And now we're back where we started. So before moving on, try and close out your previous conversation so that you're all on the same page as you have this discussion. So let's put this into practice. Assume that I'm a longtime friend of yours. I'm not a Christian. Let's say that I have a master's degree in astronomy, for example. And, we're talking around the campfire one day, and we're having some pretty deep discussions. And finally, I just look at you and I say, I don't understand why you're a Christian. Science has shown that we don't need a God to get where we are now. Biology shows us that we all evolved from a common ancestor. Geology shows us that the Earth formed from stardust over millions of years. And cosmology shows that the universe started 4.3 billion years ago from the Big Bang. God doesn't fit into that equation. Okay, pause for a second. You're going to try and use the Kalam to discuss this. Now, what's actually being objected to? What in my statement that I just made is a red herring, so a distraction? And how do you want to drive this conversation? So if I were to respond to my skeptical friend that says this, I would look at him and say, oh, well, biology, geology, cosmology, yeah, there's lots of Christians that accept evolution and the age of the Earth, and even the age of the universe. That, sure, there's some views of Scripture that don't allow for that, but lots of Christians are fully accepting of those things. You know what's more interesting than various debates over how literal Genesis was and all that? We can deal with that if you ever decide that you're really interested in Christianity and this whole thing. But what's really interesting is, let's look at the Big Bang. If we go back, then we'll see that not only space but time also began at like 4.3 billion years ago at the start of the universe. And it all expanded outward from there. And from what we understand of both philosophy and physics and everything about this world, is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. So if the universe began to exist, then it must have been caused, right? Now, me, the skeptic, says, well, I don't think that everything needs to be caused. In fact, recent work in quantum mechanics shows that many events can be uncaused or self-caused. So why would we not expect the same thing to be true of the universe? Okay, again, how would you respond to your skeptical friend here? What are they objecting to? All right, so here they're objecting to premise one, the idea that that everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's the objection. And so you could take the two lines of approach. You could either take the philosophic, there aren't really two lines here, it's just philosophy that you'd have to go with, and personal experience. And so choose which way you want to approach it. For me, I'm going to probably choose the philosophic side of things. Well, you're saying that not everything needs to be caused. I feel like there's a few issues with that, because if we're looking at quantum mechanics, then it's not like quantum mechanics just happens out of truly nothing. It happens out of the subatomic vacuum, which isn't nothing. And so I feel like it would be really weird to suggest that there was a quantum vacuum that existed before the universe did. So there's certainly no quantum vacuum that could have caused the universe. And furthermore, quantum mechanics themselves rely on the laws of nature, which is part of the universe. So again, it would be really weird to suggest that quantum mechanics and the laws governing that could actually exist prior to the universe. And I guess another issue is just this idea that we're relying on rules of quantum mechanics that haven't fully been formed yet in order to say that the universe caused itself. I don't know, that just seems really abnormal to me. Do you really think that out of truly nothing, the universe could have had quantum mechanics cause it to pop into existence? Because an infinite singularity, like the Big Bang starts from, that's not nothing. And all of the models of the Big Bang start at the Planck time, so 1 times 10 to the negative 43rd second. But that doesn't mean that's where things started. That's where math begins. If we look back, even Stephen Hawking talks about how that's just a black box that no one really knows how to get into mathematically or scientifically. So the fact that the universe started is a huge deal. All right, and so your skeptic friend might try and move on. All right, even so, you're just assuming that the universe has a beginning. There's plenty of models in physics showing that the universe has been fluctuating for all of eternity. Therefore, it wouldn't even need a cause. Or alternatively, Stephen Hawking himself, like you just mentioned, did the math to show that the space-time continuum is essentially a sphere with limited boundaries but no edges. Either way, there's nothing to explain because the universe doesn't have a beginning. All right, now remember I said that we want to try and close off previous discussions before moving on. And so my friend responds this, I might say back to them, oh, okay, that's a really interesting concept, but before we move on, would you agree then that we can't really say the universe was self-caused if it had a beginning? Go ahead and the reason that I've worded that way is if it had a beginning is I'm kind of feeding into their next objection to make them more likely to accept my rebuttal. And so my friends might say, okay, yeah, so if the universe had a beginning, then probably it needed to be caused. But I don't think it needed to have a beginning. And that's where I can come back and say, okay, well, I mean, the reason I brought up the beginning is because you're the one that suggested it was a Big Bang. So I guess that maybe the Big Bang isn't really the model that you think is most reasonable. But even so, let's look at these other models. When Stephen Hawking's talking about the Hartle-Hawking model, he uses imaginary time in order to make that work. But that doesn't actually translate to anything in reality. I mean, Hawking himself was super skeptical that the Hartle-Hawking model could actually have any real meaning within reality. It was just an interesting thought experiment more than anything else. But even so, we can't really suggest that the universe didn't have a beginning because you can't have an infinite regress of time or of causes. Because if time went back into infinity, then we're suggesting that the universe or time has crossed an infinite distance in order to get to where we are now. But that's simply not philosophically possible, right? Like if you walked up on a man that said, I'm going to count to infinity, and he started 1, 2, 3, 4, you would say, oh yes, he's trending towards infinity, but that's a potential infinite. What you're suggesting is an actual infinite, in which we might say, let's say that you walk up on another man who says 3, 2, 1, 0, and you say, oh, well, what are you doing? And he said, I just finished counting down from infinity. And now you would know that that's ridiculous, not simply because, people have limited lifespans, but it would have been impossible for him to ever get to zero. Because if he could have gotten to zero, why did he get to zero now? Why not 3 years from now? Why not 100 years ago? Why not 1,000 years ago? Why not at the beginning of the universe? Right? You can't have an infinite number of things. That just doesn't work within our reality. And so we can't have time going back infinitely. And so your skeptical friend at this point is probably going to be pretty flustered. And if they haven't cut off the conversation early, then they might object again. Well, even if we grant that the universe had a beginning, you're saying that God caused the universe, but what if God caused the universe, then what caused God? And so this is kind of used as a gotcha question, right? Of, oh, well, if God created the universe, then who created God? There's always that type of question. And so I would respond to my friend and say, no, I'm not saying that everything has a cause. I'm saying that everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? And so if, like you said, I'm suggesting, if God caused the universe, well, the universe is both space and time. So God would have existed outside of space and time. And therefore God wouldn't need a cause because God didn't have a beginning. Now that's different than an infinite series of past events in time, because there is no time where we're talking about God. We're talking about eternal and outside of time. So that's very different. So therefore God doesn't need a cause. But furthermore, even if we would think that God needed a cause, we don't need to explain our explanation in order to make it a good explanation. I mean, that would undermine the entirety of the scientific endeavor, because if I wanted to explain why the sun appears in the red-yellow spectrum, then if I figured out why that's happening, such as, oh, well, this is the wavelength of light being put off due to a certain amount of energy, well, now I need to explain how that wavelength of light occurs, and then I need to explain where that energy comes from. And if I demand an explanation for every explanation, I suppose, then we're never going to reach an actual explanation, and nothing can be explained. So it's really silly to say that you need to explain your explanation in the first place. But since God exists outside of time, then he doesn't need to be caused. And so I don't know if you're ever going to have a conversation like that. I could see myself having this conversation, and I hope I get to many, many times. And so that way I can practice it and practice my approach. But this is the kind of thing that I feel like the way that you're going to learn this argument best is by going and engaging in these conversations with your friends, with family members, other Christians at your church. Do what you can to really put this into practice so that you can understand it. And maybe if somebody ever offers an objection like this to you, it's going to be a little less shaking on your faith whenever you already know how to give the answers. The thing I want to leave us with is just this brief idea of what could have caused the universe. I mean, all of this I did really just establishes that the universe was caused. It doesn't say that it was God. It doesn't say what it was. But I think there's a couple of characteristics of this cause that we can get to. Like I mentioned earlier, time and space began to exist. That's the universe, right? The universe is time and space, so it began to exist. And so whatever caused this universe has to exist outside of time and space, so it must be timeless and spaceless. You know, another way we might look at that is eternal and all-encompassing. It must be immensely powerful because your effect can't be more powerful than your cause. And so whatever caused the universe must have more power than the entirety of the universe, which is an unfathomable amount of power. In fact, you might even say it would be omnipotent. And if it's timeless and spaceless, then there's only a few things we can think of like that, and those would be abstract objects, like numbers, for example. And, you know, there's a few abstract objects I can think of, but only one abstract object would be able to cause something, and that would be a mind. And that works really well because a mind would be the only type of abstract object as well that has agency, which would allow for that mind to freely choose to create and to cause a effect within time. Because if we were to say that the cause is eternal, then theoretically the effect should be eternal as well. Like, for example, if I had a hollow plastic ball and I tossed it on a lake, it floats because of the laws of buoyancy. It's not like it would begin to sink and then suddenly buoyancy turns on and it floats up. It would always float because it's always buoyant and buoyancy is always there. But in order to get a effect in time from an eternal cause, such as God in this situation, then that cause would need to be able to freely choose to create. And so we end with this idea that the best, at least seemingly best explanation for what could have caused the universe would be an immensely powerful, timeless, spaceless mind. I don't know about you. That sounds a lot like God. And so with the next class that we're going to get into, we're going to be talking about not just why does the universe exist, but why does this universe exist? Why is there a universe that allows for life to exist? And so that's going to be a version of the argument from design. I'm looking forward to sharing that with you.